It's like a pretty sure copy paste $1. Doesn't fall
Makita comedian the lights low.
Yep. I can do it. I got it.
Let's hope not. So they should have somewhere.
Well, I've been out of it.
They're probably doing more swimming.
Okie dokie. With that, as long as I have everyone. Everyone. Okay. Thank you guys so much for patiently waiting while we got tech figured out, but we got tech figured out, and that's all that matters. So welcome tonight. We have Shaneequa Brokenleg, and presenting Two Spirit 101. I'll let you just introduce yourself since you're already standing up and ready, but thank you all for coming. This is a great crowd. I love it. Well, let it get kicked off.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Shaneequa Brokenleg. I'm Seashore Lakota, which means I'm from Rosebud Reservation. I live in Sioux Falls right now. What else do I need to tell you? I work for the Episcopal Church as the staff officer for racial reconciliation. And I'm an Episcopal priest in the Diocese of South Dakota. I don't know what else to say. If you have a question, feel free. You can just ask or on a raise your hand. With that, I'm just going to kind of get into it and just fly through it. And you let me know if I need to slow down or if there's something you didn't understand. I will talk about things from a Lakota perspective because that's what I know. I can't speak for every tribe or every reservation. What I usually tell people is feel free to share your knowledge and your understanding and your experience, which may be different from my own. And then we will value and respect the experience and knowledge of others. And if somebody shares something in here, that's their story. Let them keep their story. Don't share it for them, but share what you learn. You can feel free to share my story. I'm obviously presenting some Beyonce and whatever. And that there can be multiple truths. Just because I've had this experience, this is what I was taught, doesn't mean that what you were taught isn't right or isn't true. And learn from this, but don't misappropriate it, right? So Two-Spirit is a word I'll talk about a little more, but to be Two-Spirit, you have to be American Indian. Well, actually, you have to be Indigenous. But so don't call yourself a Two-Spirit if you're not Indigenous. Yeah. So most people have questions about this. So I usually use this to explain. So Indigenous is the big word. It's the most all-encompassing word. That means you are Indigenous to a specific area. So if you're in North America and you're Indigenous, that means you are one of the peoples who were here before colonization, before Europeans came. And then a smaller group would be Native Americans. So there are people who are Indigenous, by the way, from like Africa or all over the world. In fact, Europeans are Indigenous to Europe. So Native American means you're Indigenous from the Americas, so North, Central, South America. And then you have a smaller group that is American Indian. That is a legal word. It means you are a member of a federally recognized tribe. So I am American Indian because I'm enrolled with Rosebud Sioux Tribe. Not all Native Americans are American Indians for a wide range of reasons, but all American Indians are Native Americans. So not all rectangles are squares, but all squares are rectangles. Everybody understand? Nope. So some of the things I'm going to be talking about, we'll talk a little bit about the history of what happened. This is my very brief, short version of that. There are sort of seasons or eras in Indian country when we think about history. And so in the colonial era are all the treaties that are like, I'm going to be nice to you and you're going to be nice to me and it's going to be unicorns and happiness and all of this. And we're gonna work together and help each other. That's like the original one, because otherwise Europeans would have died. The next set are the removal treaties. And so those are, this is my area, you can be anywhere but my area. So think 13 colonies, okay? Then the next set of treaties are movements reservations. So that changes everything. That you can only be in this area, nowhere else. Almost the opposite of the original. And then the next set is, we tended to hold property in common. We often didn't think that you could own land. And so they didn't like that we would hold it in common. And so they allotted American Indians small plots of land. And they actually only allotted the male head of household, which created a whole bunch of problems for a whole host of reasons. And they wanted us to be farmers and all that. Then the next set is Indian reorganization. During this time is when Indians moved into urban areas. They gave us the opportunity to move to urban areas and promised us things like jobs and housing and all of this. And none of that really is quite how we were told it was going to be. But that's where you see a big surge in urban Indian communities. And that's actually where the word two-spirit comes from. It's from that time. So I'll talk about that. Termination is when they were like, we're tired of dealing with the Indian problem. And so we don't want to recognize tribes or Indians in general. And so they tried to terminate a lot of tribes and saying they don't. And now we're sort of in this, I would say we're probably past this down here, but self-determination is the novel idea that maybe we know what's best for ourselves and can do it on our own. Now we're in this other area where they're trying to chip away at tribal sovereignty, and I don't know what to call it. But anyway, that's that. American Indians are unique from other communities of color. We have unique relationships with the government. Often the things that we advocate for are different and separate from what other communities of color advocate for. So most other communities of color will advocate for equal rights. They want to be treated just like everyone else. American Indians often advocate for the rights they were promised in the treaties or the things that we had a long time ago, which is often separate and different from equal rights. A lot of it has to do with like hunting and fishing and land use, and also land protection. We don't want you to put a big pipeline down our land that could bust open and pollute our environment. We don't want you burying nuclear waste in our tribal areas or sacred sites. And not all tribes are alike. Each have very unique relationships with the government, often different treaties. Different people will spell things differently. The word Ojibwe is spelled almost differently on almost every reservation in Wisconsin and Michigan. Different origin stories, different gender roles. Some tribes have clans, some tribes don't. So that's that. That's all the background. Any questions so far?
Can you use the mic?
It's not on.
Oh, you can turn it on. Sorry, I wasn't even thinking about it. Yep, it should. Great.
Okay.
Cool.
I could use the mic, but it won't make a difference. But the problem is not. So in Lakota, we have this word wakan, and it often gets translated as holy or sacred. It can mean a lot of different things, but what's important to know is it can also mean mysterious. And in our Lakota way of thinking, something that is different is considered wakan. We don't always, we don't need to understand it, but we would see that as sacred or mysterious. Whereas in Western culture, things that are different, there we go.
There.
Things that are different are often considered other or bad. Okay, so just understand that that's the perspective that we come from. And we see everything as interrelated. So we cannot separate, I cannot separate my Lakota-ness from my spirituality, or you can't ask me to separate my gender and sexuality. All of those things are integrated as a whole thing. Think of it as one really messy Venn diagram with lots of circles and a big bunch of stuff in the middle. We don't think in those boxes. And so often it's difficult when people ask me to do presentations on things. I'm like, I can't really talk about two-spirit stuff without talking about Indian history, or I can't really talk about this without talking about that. And it's just how it works. We don't have a distinct line between the physical and the spiritual realms, for example. Often Westerners will see those things as very separate. For us, they're integrated. Enough about that. If you remember, how many of you seen Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman? Okay, okay. So if you remember, or any Western really, for a community to be considered whole, right, they need usually there's a barn, there's always a bar, they need a church, maybe they want a school, right? And of course, for communities that are whole, should have a library. But you need these different things. And in our way of thinking, for a community to be considered whole, needs to have these ingredients, these people. And so we need men and women who heal with medicine. That's usually like herbs and things, traditionally anyway. And then we also need men or women who heal with ceremony. So think like priests, medicine people, shaman, if you want to call them that kind of thing. And then we need folks who are political and social leaders. These are like, think of like president, governor, like that realm. It's a specific type of leadership that has a lot more to do with helping the community make decisions. Our real leadership is a servant leadership. It's not I'm in charge telling you what to do. It's not listening to the community. It's more of a midwife, right? It's not our baby. It's your baby. We just help you push and breathe and give you ice chips and all that. Okay. And then there's Nachapi, which are like strategic leaders or military leaders, and these are a different type of leadership. Crazy Horse would have been an example of this. That it's much more targeted and specific. And then we have Heyokas, which are hard to explain because we don't have a good concept of that in our Western culture. They are a backwards person. They do things backwards. They bring balance. And they're meant to be funny, but they're also incredibly holy, spiritual, sacred people. Part of their role, if you know, how many of you know who Trevor Noah is? Okay. He would be sort of he's not backwards, but he would be an example of that. They're almost like the court jester role in England in that type of time would be similar to this. They were the only ones really who could call out the king, the court jester, right? They could make fun of the leadership. Heyokas aren't necessarily there to make fun of the leadership as much as they're there to help. Like if we're being too serious, they're there to help us be funny. If we're being too funny, they're there to help us be serious. And they're there to help us to see, like if everybody was starving, they might talk about how full they were, for example, to help us think beyond and outside boundaries and boxes. And then finally, we have Lokomi and Winkday. This is the two-spirit role in Lakota culture. So Lokomi is a female-bodied two-spirit person. And Loka is our word for man, and me is the ending that we use to make something a woman. So it kind of means like manly woman or man woman or woman who behaves in a manly way. Could mean any of those things. We eat day, which we use the word weekday now, but it's short for we eat day. And sorry, it's taking a little while to explain this. If you hear weekday and you don't speak the language, we is the woman I said already, the woman ending. Day can mean to kill. That's not what that word means. It doesn't mean to kill a woman. It's short for we ink day, and what it refers to is in Lakota we have no pronouns. So somebody's not a he or a she or a they or a it. But men speak differently than women, so they would end their words differently. And most women endings of words and sentences end in E sound. And most men ends of words end in an O sound. And so, for example, the verb to eat, women would say you tau pi, man would say you tau po, just say thank you. A man would say tulamayayo, thank you very much. Woman tulamayaye. Do you hear the difference? Okay. And so what it refers to is it's saying one who talks like a woman. And so we would have these conversations about what pronouns you would use in the Lakota culture, because you would hear the person speaking and know which pronouns they would, if we have pronouns, what pronouns they use based on the way that they spoke. And then if we do things together, like often with music or singing, you will hear both endings in some of the songs, and you will hear men sing as women and women sing as men in the singing, because it's collective and communal, if that makes sense. And if it's a women's song, all the endings would be O. And if you're singing as a woman, you'd still end it in O. If it was a women's song, you'd end it in E or A or A. And even if men were singing it, they would sing as a woman. Does that make sense? That does not make them a Lakota. Okay. I'm looking for the slide. I'm going to talk about it now because I'm worried that it might not come up. So, every tribe that I'm aware of in North America has a role like this. Okay? And we'll get to that now. So, that role is someone who walks between the masculine world and the feminine world. But we also believe that those people walk between the natural world and the supernatural world. So sort of think of them as their role is to be in the liminal space between things, okay? And they can go, if it's a spectrum, they can go all the way to the end, and they can go all the way to that end. There's not like there's a limit to it, but they're meant to be in that in-between space and to be able to walk within and between those things. And again, every tribe I'm aware of has a role like this. It's often considered a third gender. Some tribes have as many as 6 genders. Let me explain that. So just real quick, in case, how many of you know the difference between gender and sex? Okay, short and sweet, gender is about what's between your ears and sex is about what's between your legs. Easy way to think about it, okay? So you have cisgendered, which is when what's in your head between your legs is sort of what everybody else thinks of as standard. So you have cisgender male and female, and then some tribes will delineate between transgender male and female, so there'll be 2 more genders, that gets you to 4. And then some also delineate between male-bodied and female-bodied 2-spirit roles. That's how you get 6, in case you're wondering. In Lakota culture, at least traditionally anyway, we had men, we had women, and then we had this third gender of Lokami and Minke. And so that would be like the third. And depending on if you delineate between a male-bodied one and a female-bodied one, then we would have 4. But usually we just talk about it. Okay. And this, folks that are in this category have unique spiritual and social roles in their community. But I'm just going to talk about this person a little bit in case it doesn't come up again later. This is Weewa. She's not Lakota, she's Zuni, which is like from the Southwest. And she's a very famous 2-spirit person. She was beloved by her tribe, and there's actually a book about her, maybe a couple. The tribe wouldn't make any decisions without her being present. And so when the government came to try and get certain treaties to be signed, they understood that the tribe wouldn't do anything unless she was there. And so recognizing that, they thought that she was a leader, which she was, but she was not the quote-unquote person in charge. And so they talked to her and asked her to come to DC, and so she did. And she got invited to balls, she got to meet the president, she got to do all this wonderful stuff. And the doctor was like, "Can I examine you?" And she's like, "Okay." And the doctor did, and saw she had a penis and freaked out, and then sent her home. So she went back to her community, and she was like, "It was great. I got to go to balls. I got to do these things. It was so much fun." And then this doctor freaked out because he saw my penis, and they were like, "We don't know you have a penis." Like it wasn't even a thing to them. They couldn't understand what the problem was. Anyway, okay, there's a lot more involved in her story, but I like to tell this story. So these are some traditional 2-spirit roles. Often because we walk between those different things and we're in the liminal space, we can understand both sides of a story or more sides of a story, and so we're often used as a mediator. Social workers, we often have a lot of love medicine type of action. So like if you like someone and you found out they liked you come talk to us and we kind of coach you how to hit on the person, in other words. And sometimes people who are shy would be like, hey, have you thought of talking to someone? Because we're often thought of as healers, spiritual, physical, emotional healers, and so you'll see a lot of us being medicine people. When you saw those roles that make a whole community, you can be in more than one of those roles at the same time. So often the person who heals with ceremony is also the same person who heals with medicine. And sometimes two-spirit people would be heyokas too. I have not heard of a two-spirit from Lakota culture that was also a military leader. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen, it just means I didn't. We're often thought of as peacemakers again because we can sort of see both sides of the story and be reconcilers. And because of that walk between, we often look for translation, and that's often why we need to be present for the signing of things, because we want to make sure that we can see it from the European perspective, but also from our perspective, and watch for the community and make sure that they have it. In Lakota culture, Winkta often would give names, and families would ask us to give their kids a Winkta name, which is unique and separate from their regular Lakota name. And apparently we were stingy with it because families had to sort of court us to get the name. They would ask, and they have to give us gifts, and apparently we didn't give everybody a name. I don't know why, but that Winkta name is very special and sacred. And a lot of our famous Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, a lot of our famous leaders had a Winkta name. It doesn't make them a Winkta, just music. At moments of great need, you invoke that name when you pray, and that gives you extra energy or power or whatever you want to call it to pray. And those names are often, if I were to say them in English, highly inappropriate. One name that I heard was Penis Nose. And I think an example of that, why that happened, is because if I was dying and I was, and I was praying and I had to say, hey God, this is Penis Nose, I think that I might find myself humorous and maybe I would get energy out of that moment. I don't know. But they often were silly or different like that. But again, because they were different, we believe that they were sacred. Let's see, often we were thought as prophets. Some of us joined war parties and were often called to bring spiritual balance. And again, if your community is, let's say, very male heavy, we need to be in the role of a female. If the community is very female, we want to be in the role of a male. We often also release children a lot as respite for families, and that still happens a lot on reservations. One of the reservations that I worked with, I used to be an epidemiologist, and I worked in northern Wisconsin for the Bemidji area, which is like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. And in one of the tribes, the biggest foster parents there were this lesbian couple. And everybody, I think the one's name was Bruiser. But everybody has a nickname in Indian country. But together they must have fostered, I think, over 60 children over the course of their time. And that's just what they were. That's the role that they had. And often if you talk to other weekdays in the reservations here, a lot of them will be raising a nephew or niece or whatever because of whatever the need might be. If you need this, I can email to you. These are just, this is the A and the B, but I have a lot of different names, different two-spirit folks, and kind of what it translates to. Every tribe will have slightly different, sorry, the music break. Every tribe will have slightly different ways of translating. And there are two-spirit-ish roles outside of the US. That's always important to know. So in a lot of different indigenous communities, they have roles like this. So Kamamahu in the Polynesian area is often one. Fafafine, I've heard of it, Samoa. Philippines and Thailand, the lady boys, Katoi, that's a very common one. And if you look prior to colonization, they often are highly respected folks. After colonization, there's often some problems. We can talk about why that is. We probably will, actually. So this is how we got the word two-spirit. Before contact, each tribe had their own word for this thing. They were the words. And after contact, anthropologists and folks who study things use this word, Burdash, which most natives do not like. Burdash is actually a Persian word, and it has connotations of there's sexual implications in that word that we don't like, and subservient type of relationships and things like that, which also we didn't like. It didn't describe us well. Now, here's what happened. Remember I talked about moving Native folks into urban areas like Minneapolis, Sioux Falls, Denver, Oakland, LA, Seattle, et cetera, all over. As all these different tribes came together in these urban areas, we would talk amongst each other, and we understood that there was this two-spirit roles in our communities. Of course, we all had different language. The word in Ojibwe is different from the word in Lakota. The word in Navajo is different, and so as we talked about, we understood that we had similar roles, that the two-spirit folks had similar roles, and so we wanted to have a word to talk about, and most of us all use English to talk to each other. And so at a two-spirit gathering, some of the folks, and there is somebody who's credited with coining the phrase, came up with this word two-spirit, meaning you have the spirit of the masculine and the spirit of the feminine. And as they came up with, so it's an invented and created word, just and know that that word does not translate well back into the indigenous languages. So it's when they talk about it, the understanding was we would only use that word in English, although I have seen other tribal folks translate it back into their own language, which, like in Lakota, for example, we have different words for spirit. We have Wanahi, which is like a ghost. We have Monia, which is like a different kind of spirit. And so when you translate that back, it could sound like someone could be possessed. And that's not the connotation that we want to have with this. And so often it's only used in English. Okay. So I'm just going to have some different pictures of some two spirits that have been documented from the past. This is Ashtish, who's Crow, who, in this picture, they're in their mourning, M-O-U-R mourning dress. And this person had been married to a woman for a long time. And another thing to think about, I guess, is that for two-spirit folks, it was more about the spiritual and social role, not so much about who we had sex. There wasn't a requirement that you could or couldn't have sex with some genders, but that wasn't the point, I guess, if that makes sense. We all had sex. That wasn't what we focused on, I guess, which is so interesting because in Western culture, that's even what the word is, right? Homosexual, bisexual, they all ended that. Okay, so I don't remember what else to say about Ashtish, but yeah. And this is Viva, which I already talked about. You heard her story. I do not know how to say this word because I don't speak Ojibwe, but this person was a leader and led a military strike. And you can see them with their weapon. Charlie the Weaver, this is the person on the right with his Dene friend. And what's interesting to know here is Charlie has a woman outfit from the waist down, the man outfit from the waist up. So you'll often see a lot of these different mixing and matching, depending on whatever the name is, depending on whatever you might be doing. There wasn't a requirement that you have to behave as a man. And in Lakota culture, for example, if you were a trans man, you were just a man. If you were a trans woman, you were just a woman. And you would dress like a man, and you would dress like the only people who walked between those were the two spirits. What else to say about this? Yeah. Was that a hand raise, or were you just dusting your hair? Okay. This is a kitchen woman. She is dressed like a man. As you can see, she's shirtless and in the warrior outfit. So that would be example of a female-bodied two-spirit. This one, there's quite a bit of documentation. Lozen and Tadatsi, and they were two Apache women who fought alongside Geronimo. And I don't remember which one's which. Lozen was a medicine woman who never married and fought alongside the men. Her name translates to a shield to her people. And she was captured and died of tuberculosis. And then Tadatsi, while being more feminine, still fought with Geronimo's band. And she was a translator and a scout. And she, until the end of her life, did mourn the loss of Lozen. She did remarry, I believe, a man. And these are two Lakota women who lived together until their death. And they were somewhat well documented. I actually don't know where this is. I think it's published, but I'm not sure. I just want the picture set up there a little bit so you can see it. I don't have a lot to say about this. And these are two Navajo or Dene boys. This picture's from 1937. The next picture that I have is kind of a funny story, and I'll share that in a minute. Okay. I don't know this person's name, but they're in all sorts of pictures. So before, when we first got colonization, there's a lot, well, there still is a lot of poverty, and it's very hard to do certain, do entrepreneurial things on reservations. There's a lot of political red tape to get business licenses and things like that, because there's a lot of different, what is red tape? Tribal red tape, state red tape, federal red tape, all these things. Sometimes they all have to agree. Anyway, so a lot of folks, we did this in Rosebud too, back when I-90 went down by Rosebud and not that's the only way we. Anyway, let me not get into that. So this is a male-bodied two-spirit Navajo woman. Most of the tourists who went by and took pictures of her, she would, you take a picture with her and give her money. They didn't realize that she was a two-spirit, and they didn't realize that she was male-bodied. And so there's all these pictures, tourist pictures from all over, and you can see a lot of them sometimes buy them in, if you go down to Mexico and stuff. And it's just funny, she was holding the baby, nobody knew. I think if they did, they probably would have been scandalized to some extent. But it was just, it's funny that she's in all these pictures nobody knew. And that happens a lot. I think we kind of can be androgynous sometimes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about religion and how Western culture impacted what happened. So back in the day, we had our all traditional spirituality, and some tribes have multiple, quote unquote, religions. Most all of them have just one, but some have multiple. And not all of them have names for it because everybody was the same religion. If that makes sense. So, in Lakota culture, we don't have a word for the religion. Catholics call it the pipe religion, but they made up that word for us. We would just say it's our way of life. Some tribes do have a word. Navajo calls it the blessing way or the beauty way or Hoshon. Okay, so after the so now you have Christianity coming, and then you have traditional spirituality, and then a lot of folks will be comfortable sitting in the in-between space between both of those. At any given funeral, wedding, whatever, you often will see elements of both. My grandpa, who was a priest in Rosebud, he would often get called in to come to sun dancers' funerals and things, and he would be asked to pray, and he would pray Christian prayers, and they understood him as a holy man. And that was what he did. And when my grandpa died, we invited the traditional people to come and pray at his funeral, and they prayed in the Lakota sun dancing way and sang sun dance songs that we understand them as sacred people. And they're, you know what I mean? Like there wasn't this is right and this is wrong kind of idea. However, that does happen. So the early theological question that was asked was, must one become a Jew before one becomes a Christian? And Paul, in all of his letters that he wrote, like Romans, all the Corinthians, all those letters, he said, no, you don't have to become a Jew before you can become a Christian. However, somehow during colonization, they forgot that. And so they thought that we had to become white before we could become a Christian. And you see this very big rejection of all the things that are sacred in our way, right? So they don't like our ceremonies, they don't like whatever. That's the old school theological idea. Now, you often hear Christians talk about Jewish people have their own creation story, their own history, their own ceremonies. They happen to all write them down in what we call the Old Testament, which they would call the Hebrew Bible or the Torah. And our ceremonies and our stories and our things are sacred in themselves, just like those. And that's our Old Testament, or our one. We just didn't write it down. Ours is all oral. Okay. So today we have that same question: must one become straight before they can be Christian, or must one become cisgender before they become Christian, etc. So with colonization came this deep suppression of two-spirit folks, and so you saw a lot of harming of them. They were often incarcerated, a lot of violence, and often leaders were reluctant to defend them because the leaders would want, they had, one of the things about Indians are we were very collective rather than individualistic. So they were thinking about how can we help the whole community. So it's okay if this one could sacrifice to help the whole community. And that's how that happened. And some two-spirits were placed into hiding, and a lot of folks lost the traditional roles or the ceremonies and all of that kind of stuff. And that happened in multiple tribes. And in Lakota culture, for example, we have a ceremony now. We had a ceremony a long time ago, but nobody really knew exactly. We lost it in a way. People knew like elements of it, but they didn't know exactly what it involved. And so then they sort of had to create it later, and that's the wiping of the tears. If you go back, there's no like perfect example from like 400 years ago what that looked like exactly. We know there was elements of it involved X, Y, and Z. There wasn't like a good passing on of that. That wiping of the tears, what you do like when you end the mourning period after someone dies, it's just a year. But now you see it almost on every reservation at the moment. Okay. In 1862, there was a Dakota conflict, which happened in Minnesota. Big drama, lots of drama. It's how we got the hanging in Mankato, which is the largest mass hanging in the history of our country. After that, President Grant, in his infinite wisdom, let me start with how that happened. Every reservation, let's pretend we're all a reservation, was assigned an Indian agent who was responsible for the welfare and the caretaking of that reservation. The Indian agents were often corrupt and would pocket money or not give it to the tribes or all these things, or like have their friend charge 3 times what it was and they pocket a third, the friend keeps a third, and the tribe actually gets what it costs. And so there was a lot of starvation and all of that. And this happened a lot. So President Grant, in his infinite wisdom with the Quakers, decided that what we'll do is we'll make churches the Indian agents, because as we know, churches never do anything wrong. And so they assigned religions to each reservation. And this is a map of which denominations were assigned to which reservations. And at the time, these are what the reservations were called. Now it's sort of shifted with multiple tribes and things. But there were 4 requirements for denomination to be assigned reservations. I can't remember what they were. But they had to have an Office of Indian Affairs within the denomination. They had to have demonstrated work with the community and ability to speak the language. I don't remember everything, but there was a rule about it. So you see here, like if each of you was a different, you'd be Methodist, you'd be Catholic, you'd be Lutheran, you'd be Presbyterian. Where it says friends, that means the Quakers, just FYI, the Quakers call themselves friends. There's a couple that I sometimes have to explain. The Dutch Reformed, you don't see that a lot around here, but you do see it. It's a Protestant. Congregational is what often is Presbyterian, same thing with American Board, that also became Presbyterian. A lot of the denomination, and if you look here, Cheyenne River, Missouri, Whetstone, those are all Episcopalian. Guess what? I'm Episcopalian. I wonder why. A lot of the denominations realized they were in over their head, and so they ended up pulling out. And then the big ones that came in to sort of cover that were Episcopal, Catholic, and Quakers. So most of them, even if they started off in these ways, they would end up as a Catholic, Episcopalian, or Quaker. And the idea was then that they would have to be indoctrinated into that denomination, whatever. Most folks, I don't know how many of you identify as Christian. Most folks are not familiar with this. It's not something we're taught in catechism. It's a very god-awful and unfortunate thing that happened. Most all of them ran boarding schools, which is what happened, which involved a lot of other things and a lot of abuse and stuff. Okay. These are examples of Chiricahua Apache children entering boarding school on the left. They've just gotten off a 3-day train ride from somewhere in the Southwest over to Carlisle Boarding School, which is in Pennsylvania. And these are the same children 4 months later. And they have lots of pictures. These are all documented well. They tried to show this is how we're improving all that. What I'd like to point out for these is that everything you see that these children are wearing means something, okay? Like in my culture, if you have 2 braids versus 1 braid, if you have 1 braid and not a braid on the other side, each of those 3 different things means something. Just like if you have a ring on this finger, that means something. If I'm doing something priestly, I'll wear my clergy collar, that means something, right? If you take those things away, you're taking away that person's identity. The fact that this boy here is wearing that bandana probably means that he went through the rites to be considered an adult. And so when you take it away again, you're taking away that person's identity. And so I'm just going to talk about historical trauma because I think that's important. So in a healthy society, you have one generation who passes on what I like to call cultural DNA, think of it that way. Their culture, their parenting skills, customs, language to the next generation. They pass that on to the next generation. And so even if that first generation isn't there anymore, you're getting that same cultural DNA. Think about how many of you are Vikings fans, how many of you are Packer fans, how many of you are Bronco fans. What is considered a Thanksgiving dinner? Must it have ham? Must it have turkey? Is it Thanksgiving? Those are subtle, superficial examples. But like, how do you handle conflict? Do you scream and yell, or do you whisper loudly behind closed doors, or all of those things? Those are examples of that cultural DNA that you probably learned from your family, your relatives, or even your community, right? With historical trauma, something interrupts that cultural DNA transmission. This is a picture from the boarding school in the town where I used to work as an epidemiologist. What I asked people is, how many children in this picture are smiling? Right? Maybe just 1, maybe 2 in the middle, those little girls. And this school was a day school. Like the kids could go home after school. It's still but if they were going away, then they got shipped off to Mount Pleasant, which is in Michigan, which is hundreds of miles away. What a lot of people, this was in my, I think, 6th grade social studies book. What people don't know, and I think, what is it called? Balboa setting his dogs upon Indian practitioners of male love, I think is how it's defined here. What most people don't know is that these people down here are 2 spirits. And what often happened is because we were spiritual leaders, people often saw us as like killing two birds with one stone. They could kill this thing they perceived as sinful and bad, and then they can also kill the religious knowledge keepers and that kind of things. There are lots of other examples of historical trauma. Can you think of any? No. Come on, you guys. So, enslavement, right? Chattel slavery, good. Sure, yes, the Holocaust, yeah. One that we don't often think of is HIV/AIDS and LGBT community. Like you have this several generations gone in the 80s and 90s with AIDS, and that sort of interrupted a lot of the cultural DNA transmission and totally shifted how the community is, how we behave. Before that, there was all these like hanky codes and different things, and the whole language that people like, maybe not language, jargon, I don't know what the right word is, that people would speak, and that sort of disappeared. We didn't have a lot of and there was a huge shift in the if it was called considered a corporate culture, whatever culture, how that worked. So migration, intergenerational poverty is a good example also, and of course child separation. And so here's how that works. Something interrupts that cultural DNA transmission. With American Indians, it's government policies and boarding schools. And so you have this generation that's missing it. And so then what gets passed on is all the loss of language, religion, land, abuse, genocide, all of that. And so even though the boarding schools don't exist anymore and the government policies have gotten better, that cultural DNA has been changed now. It's what's getting passed on to the next generation. And so when people are like, that was so long ago, why can't you just get over it? This is why. It's like a cancer, right? Cancer is like a bad DNA in a cell and it keeps replicating and replicating. Until we heal this, it will not change, right? And when people talk about reparations or whatever, it's not necessarily money that folks need. I mean, it could be, but really we need to think is how are we healing this? What is our responsibility in this? And so somebody asks you, that's kind of an easy way to, it's not that easy, but a way to answer. Folks understand. These are some of the symptoms of historical and generational trauma. The one that I always point out is the one up here. So there are certain populations, at least for American Indians, that we are very uncomfortable around. Religious leaders, government officials, researchers, and the medical institution. Those are the big four. And if you ask Black folks, they will have a subtle difference. You've got law enforcement, the government, and the medical system, right? And it will shift depending on what the situation is and what the historical trauma is, where that trust is. And so what I tell people is, if you want to work in communities, which of course we should all be in right relationship with ourselves, with each other, with the creator, with creation, it takes time for people to see you as an individual and get to know you. If I come with my collar on, they're going to see me as a representative of this institution that has a lots of. And you don't have to have all of these to be considered that you have historical trauma. Some people just have one, some people have a few, some people have all. So within Indian country, there is some denial of the history of two spirits and their existence. Often same-sex relationships have been seen as a white thing, like an external thing. We do have homophobia in Indian country. And in some communities, it's worse than others. There's some shunning, like sometimes they don't allow certain folks to be in ceremonies and in the community in certain ways. That I've seen a lot more on the East Coast and some parts of Canada. And of course, avoidance of the topic. That has not been my experience. My experience growing up, especially I think because we're so remote in Rosebud, like my grandparents told me about wink days, they didn't tell me I was wink day, they just told me about wink days and what our role was and how we're supposed to live our life, how we're supposed to serve the community. If people ask us to pray, we're supposed to pray, all of this stuff. And they introduced me to other wink day people. One of them was a medicine person who I'm related to. One of them was a curator of a museum. One of them was a medical provider. And later, I'll talk about later, about coming in. But later when I sort of came in, then they were like, you know, this person, you know, this person, you know, this person. If you have a question that we can answer, you can talk to them. And so this will vary from community to community how it's treated. What it is. And then within the non-Indian community, there's objectification and normalization, not just in the LGBT community, that happens outside too, but how like, we're seen as objects rather than people. I think that's part of the reason we have all those missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. It comes from that sort of thing. There's a lack of culturally sensitive services for Two-Spirit folks. One, kudos to South Dakota Urban Indian Health, who they had a Two-Spirit group in Sioux Falls. They included a Two-Spirit track in their cultural camp. So they had a men camp, a women camp, and a visit for children to learn about the culture. And they had a Two-Spirit track for folks to attend. Pressure to assimilate. I know often, not just Indians, but other communities of color, there's like this idea that are you gay first or are you the whatever identity you have first? And you cannot be both. You have to be whatever the stand is, which often I don't like that at all. And I remember people saying when I got my public health degree, like, oh, you're going to want to work in HIV so you can work in the gay community. And I'm like, I actually don't like the gay community. They're very like white and male, and they don't want to talk about their racism. They don't want to talk about their misogyny. And I, as an Indian, I could be my whole self. I have had like very little problems. I think in 6th grade, somebody said faggot. The teacher stopped the class, did a big lecture on Wink Day and our role, and we're sacred and we're supposed to be treated. Didn't like acknowledge or not acknowledge that I was Wink Day. Like that wasn't a question I had answered yet. But she explained, never again did I hear that word come up until I went to Todd County High School, where it was from white students, not from students. And so everywhere I've worked, I've been fully accepted, whether it be the Episcopal Church or as an epidemiologist in Indian country, whatever. Let's see, and of course misappropriation. I think Village People YMCA or folks being like, we're going to do this sweat lodge, you know, all that kind of stuff. When does this go till, by the way?
We close at 8.
Okay. So far, does anybody have any questions so far? I'm going to, yes.
If you could help me understand, because the term Indian or Indian country, because there's some people who think saying Indian might be a bad thing, and then you hear other natives to refer to themselves as Indian or being in Indian country.
That's a great question. And so like I had in the beginning with those different pieces, right? So Indian is a legal word that means somebody who's a member of a federally recognized tribe. There's various folks who are like, I grew up calling myself Indian, so I'm very comfortable with that. I am enrolled, very comfortable with calling myself that. But it's kind of like whether you say African American or Black in some communities, right? Like in our own community, we might call ourselves Indian, but if you want to be safe, say Indigenous. An Indian country is a word that we often use to describe like all of the spaces that Indian people exist in, whether physically or politically. So it could be all the reservations, plus the urban Indian areas, plus like National Council of American Indians, and you know, all of that is Indian country. And so when we say, and that would include Canada and Central America and all of that. So when we say Indian country, they're talking about a wide expanse of lots of things. Did that answer?
Yeah,
okay.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So I usually talk about healing and reconciliation because that's my job. But it's important to think about how are we doing that work, both as like if we're LGBT folks and LGBT community, how are we healing and reconciling with the racism that we have in our community and the misogyny we have in our community, and incorporating American Indian folks and Two-Spirit folks into that. Like now you're starting to see the 2S added to the LGBT sometimes, and I would argue it needs to be there because we're the fish peoples here. Like we had gay marriage before gay marriage was a thing. Before Europeans ever came, we had gay marriage. And I love when people are like, this is foreign. I'm like, no, it's not. It's been here before you ancestors ever were here. Okay. So there's this word in Lakota, sorry, we have a lot of language today. We're Lakota. And that is the state when all things are in right relationship. So when we are in right relationship with ourselves, with each other, with the creator, and with creation, okay? And this is sort of how we get there, right? Connection, relationship, deep listening, conversation. The words in Lakota that have "wo" at the beginning, that means it's an action word. It means we must do something to make it happen. It means it doesn't just happen on its own. And I wish we had more a concept like "wo" in English. Because, for example, love is an action word, but we often think of it as just a feeling, right? But that means there should be an action attached. This is developed from the Phillips Powderhorn Cultural Wellness Center, which is now just called the Cultural Wellness Center out of the Twin Cities. What it says is, as we lose our culture, we are going to lose our health. We will lose our sense of belonging and self-worth, and be vicious cycle, and that leads to isolation, which then we feel less belonging, depression, lethargy, and then that leads to ill health. This is their model of health. And that's sad and depressing. But you can have the opposite happen. If we create a philosophy of community, if we engage in community, if we help build community, then we can have folks increase their interaction and connection, which leads to positive sense of belonging and self-worth, which then leads to optimism and be healthy, right? Concrete story example of that is this. This is from the town where I used to live and work in Wisconsin. The man in the back is an artisan. He approached in the town, Lakota, there was a little K through 8 school, and it's a public school, but it's on the reservation. The principal was white. Most all the kids that go there are Native. There's another story there. Okay, he was like, I want to do something with the kids to incorporate culture into what they're doing, and so we talked, and the principal was like, okay, well we'll let you come in and build a canoe with them. And so the kids in whatever grade it was learned how to harvest the bark from the tree in a way that's sustainable, so it doesn't hurt the tree. They learned about math and science and how to measure and all this kind of stuff. They learned about the environment. They learned about art. And what used to happen at that school is the kids leave 8th grade, they go to the high school, which is in the white neighboring town, and they just fail miserably because they're exposed to systemic racism that exists at that school. A perfect example, the volleyball team, undefeated in 8th grade. They all tried out for the high school volleyball team. Not one of them got up, not one. That is not about their ability. That is about something else. They built this canoe, and I was leaving work for lunch and going to like the gas station or to get fried chicken, whatever it was. I'm going to help you. But anyway, then I see all these people lined up along the street. What is going on? Of course, I'm nosy, so I'm like, what's going on? And then like the kids are putting the canoe in the water today. And so you see this whole street just lined up people, elders and their walkers coming down the thing, put on the street, and like, and so I look down and there's these kids walking down the street. The principal was there, and the artisan was there, and the kids were there, and they're just filled with like this sense of pride and accomplishment. And the community is there acknowledging their presence and talking about how valuable they are. And I just think that was like a vaccination against some of that systemic racism that they're experiencing when they go to the high school. And they got there, they put the canoe in the water, and this is them having the canoe around. Of course, it did this thing, worked really well. Now it's a part of the museum, it's above the thing. It's just they don't use it anymore, but they've incorporated this idea into all of the schools. So in the fall, the kids learn about wild ricing. In the winter, they learn about spearing, making decoys that they use to get the fish to come when they spear them through the fishing call. In the spring, they learn about maple sugaring, and all of that gets incorporated into their coursework. It's just a really neat and wonderful model. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. This is an example of a church that did something similar in Vancouver. They I'll skip it. Just know that they incorporated Native folks and really worked on culture and how can they do that. And so the tribal folks, North West Coast does these button blankets and give them a mask. So less than a mask. It's just cool that they're both Mexican colors. You'll see a lot of renewal and recognition happening now amongst the Two-Spirit community, and often that's probably why I'm here. It's becoming more well known. And so we have these Two-Spirit societies that have been developed in different areas. I know Denver has one. They often have like an international gathering, usually once every other year. Two-Spirit folks come from all over Canada, North America. Well, Canada is North America, but even United States, Canada, and Central America. And folks coming in within their communities. And this is Alexandra Wilson, who's a Two-Spirit, female body Two-Spirit. She sort of talks about this idea of coming in versus coming out. And so coming out is the idea that I'm going to, I internally understand that I'm LGBT, whatever, and I'm being honest about myself and authentic, and I'm fully expecting that I'm going to get some negative experiences as I live out my identity in my community. Coming in is like sort of a different way of doing that. Coming in is that we understand what that Two-Spirit role is, and us coming into our community to live into that spiritual and social role in our community. And that was definitely kind of my experience in my community, and also the other communities that I've lived in Wisconsin. That's actually how I ended up becoming a priest. In Wisconsin, I was there and people knew who I was. And then I started getting asked to do all these things. Like, can you come and pray for my brother and sing songs because he's dying of cancer? So you go and you sing songs. I'm like, they're going to be in Lakota. She's like, that's fine. Sing the song. She's like, okay, he died. This is more emotional than this, but he died. Can you do his funeral? I'm like, no. A priest has to do the funeral. Let me go. I can get you a priest to the funeral. So I talked to the priest in the church I went to. And she was like, oh no, lay people can do funerals. Here's the service, go to the funeral. And I was like, okay. And so that started this whole thing. I ended up being the chaplain at the hospital part-time because they had no Native chaplains and they needed somebody to do the Indian stuff and the Christian stuff. And they have to be separate, but they needed somebody to do both. And then the old ladies at church were like, you should be a priest. And I was like, you don't know. And then the Native Christian people were like, you should be a priest. I'm like, you don't know. What scared me was when all the traditional people who were not Christian were like, you are called to be a priest. And I was like, okay, I guess I better listen now. So that's kind of it for what I have. A lot of these pictures came from Harlan Fruin from the Northeast Two-Spirit Society. So I just want to give acknowledgement to him for those. Thank you very much. What questions do you have? I can stay here till whenever they close, but I'm happy to talk with you about whatever questions. Yeah.
You mentioned transgender as separate from Two-Spirit, am I correct? It's
Yes.
like Two-Spirit more fluid and transgender have identified in a certain way?
Yeah, well, from a Lakota perspective, traditionally, we saw transgender folks as whatever gender that they identified with. So if you were biologically a male, but you identified as a female, you would be considered a female. We wouldn't delineate between them, and vice versa. And so the Two-Spirit folks would walk in between. They were sort of like non-binary, maybe be a different way of thinking about it. Nowadays, transgender is really kind of like a spectrum, and it can be somebody whose the sex assigned at birth is inconsistent with their gender identity, whether it be a little bit or a lot. And so it could include someone who is taking hormones and expects to physically transition and do all of those things, or it could be someone who just doesn't identify that way. It's more all-encompassing that. And I'm often included in that transgender group, as non-binary is kind of included in that group. As a Two-Spirit person, I'm like, well, I'm not transgendered in the sense that I'm trying to change anything. I just am a third gender. So it's like, so I kind of fit under the umbrella, maybe, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question in a very esoteric and maybe? Yeah.
This is kind of a broader question. with regard to transgender works, but to what extent is traditional Sioux culture retained on the reservations?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that. In my community, we have folks who are very traditional, and we have folks who are somewhere in the middle. I mean, I don't think because we had so much culture loss, I don't think it is exactly how it was before. There's no way to do that. But I would say there are folks who are trying to live their life as authentically as possible. Language retention is a huge problem across Indian country, even like Navajo, where it's like almost every Navajo can speak their language. Now you don't see that as much anymore. And so I think there's a lot of issues with stuff. How are we educating our young people? But you are seeing part of that reconciliation piece that's really neat. Red Cloud Indian School, which used to be Holy Rosary, or Roly Hosary if we were playing basketball. They recognized that they were part of eliminating the language from this whole group of people. And so one of the things that they've done is they actually have a immersion daycare and an immersion school to try and make sure they're building up the Lakota language in these children, and be a part of the solution, part of the key. And my friend, who is very traditional, she's a sun dancer, she's not Two-Spirit, they asked her to come and work as the grant writer, or I can't remember something. And she's like, oh, I can work for the kids, like, blah, blah, blah. And she was like, so when I prayed about it, I went to that on the hill, and she's like, you know, if they were trying to do some reconciliation, but I don't change, I'm gonna have to do some reconciliation too. So she's like, so now she's been working for them, she loves it, and she's like, then one time on her Facebook, she's like, I went to mass. Like, I went to mass. I didn't take communion. She's like, oh, I just love her. She's really funny. But anyway, her daughter goes to the daycare, and I think now she's in kindergarten. But yeah. And I saw something about
is there a Spirit Society around here?
So Muffy and Philippa, who are Pine Ridge, started an organization, I think it's called Uniting Resilience. And they're sort of based west of her. They're both from Pine Ridge, well, at least one of them is. I think they both are. And is it based in Rapid?
Yes.
Okay, it's based in Rapid. And you see them organizing. For the last 2 years, we've had a Two-Spirit Powwow in Sioux Falls. I think they're having their first one this year in Rapid. First one was last year, sorry. Since they're here knows way more about what's going on in the community. Yeah.
This is why Lawrence is always available.
Want to get on the listserv, he always sends out emails, and that was full of wonderful information. So I would encourage you to get in touch with him. But yeah, so they've had that, and like I said, South Dakota Marine Health has done some really great stuff around that. The person who's really sort of taking the charge of that moved to Minnesota, or the persons I should say, April and Darren, and I'm really sad that they're gone. But there are, I don't think there's an official community necessarily, but there are pockets, and I've even seen like my relative who is a spiritual leader, he leads a sun dance, and he's like, I'm going to do a sun dance. It is not a gay sun dance, he said, but basically everybody that was there was pretty much Two-Spirit or gay. But he had one, and that was I think 2 years ago. I don't know if they did it again last year. Anyway, yeah.
That's another question I have. Weekend. Are all sorts of people allowed to wear those dances, or are they very good?
So if it's a community wachipi, everybody can come. And anytime you hear the MC be like, intertribal, everybody powwow, that includes all of you. That includes white people, intertribal, meaning every tribe, not just native tribes, white tribes too. And so you can get up there and dance if you want. I will say that when I was a kid, one of my favorite things to do when they did that, and they would encourage the white people to dance, was to laugh at them. Because they would dance funny. We would see how they're dancing, you know, and that was one of our favorite things. So I will always tell you that may happen. You may have children tickle, but we see you as a part of the community and the fact that you're participating is a good thing. I have, even when I was little, we had some two-spirit people who did dance at the powwow. And again, my friend Jennifer, who I talked about just a minute ago, she was a competition fancy shawl dancer. And the instructions she got from her elders was, because some of them would compete, and so she would be competing alongside these two-spirit people. And the elders said, everybody who's in that circle, you respect them. I don't care if they're this, that, or the other, you respect them if they're in this. And I don't know if that's the same education that other people got, but she definitely was raised very traditional. That was the education that she was. And I've seen other times where things like that have been said. And I remember one time I was going to get my ear pierced, 7th grade or something, and I went with my other friend, and we both getting ears pierced, and the lady was like, well, you must want it on this side because you don't want to be gay. And the dad of the other kid was like, you should be so lucky that you could pierce a Wednesday's ear. And like he corrected her. And was like, so yeah. Okay, well, thank you so very, very much for coming. I'll stay here for a little while if you want to talk. I'm grateful to the Brookings Public Library for inviting me and having me out. And if you need my contact information, I'm happy to share it if you have other questions. Thank you.